Welcome to week 13. This week we'll be talking about generalization and self-management. Our lesson outcomes for the week: define and differentiate among stimulus generalization, maintenance, and response generalization. Describe 7 approaches to programming for generalization. In chapter 12, we will look at characterizing instances of information or systematic self-management in one's own behavior, and then explaining the roles of goal setting, self-recording, self-evaluation, self-reinforcement, self-punishment, and self-instruction for students with mild and severe disabilities, as well as students who are at risk. So chapter 11 is all about providing for generalization of behavior change. So back in chapter 3, they talk about the response hierarchy. And response levels defined there, just to go back and refresh. We always start out with acquisition of a new skill. We move a student to fluency, eventually move them to maintenance, seeing that they can maintain the skills that they've learned. And then we move to the generalization piece, seeing that they can take that same skill, apply it over different settings, apply it with and without reinforcement, and apply it basically anywhere they go. When we write maintenance and generalization objectives in an IEP, they differ from acquisition objectives. So most of the time in IEPs, this is the part that gets missed. So we're writing for acquisition and fluency of a skill. Once a student has that down really well, rather than just dismiss that student, what we may want to do is move them into those next levels of maintenance and generalization to make sure that those behaviors hold stable once we remove different components of their behavior plan. So the way that these differ, the first way is that conditions under which the behavior is to be performed is defined a little differently. So, for example, if we're talking about a student who blurts out in whole group, we may want to see them, instead of just observing them in whole group, may want to observe them throughout the day in all classes, different settings, different times a day, what have you, to make sure that they are performing that consistently. And then that criteria is defined for performance. So what does that look like? When we're teaching an acquisition and fluency, we're looking for mastery of the skill. However, when we move into maintenance and generalization, we are looking for, can the student perform it in a way that is similar to their peers? Okay, we know that all kids are not perfect. We know that we could give any kid a behavior chart, even the most well-behaved student, and they wouldn't necessarily get 100% on a behavior chart every day, just depending on what the behavior is. So we have to allow for some of those natural things to happen as well, to where they look like other peers. Basically, we don't want to hold them in too high of regards. We want to understand that they are still kids at the end of the day. So before suggesting guidelines for generalization, we have to differentiate between several different types of generalization. We talk about 3 different ones in the text. The first one is stimulus generalization. That's when responses have been reinforced in the presence of specific stimuli, but then occur under different but still similar stimuli. So um, again, things that we want to see that we can change up pieces of the environment and the skill still transfers. The second one is maintenance. Maintenance is when we talk about a student's continued performance of a behavior over time, even after their behavior analysis procedures have been withdrawn. So after we start to remove supports from the behavior intervention plan. And then the third one would be response generalization. That would be when the changes in one behavior prompt other changes in their behavior. And we're talking about positive changes. The book gives an example of a teacher reinforcing students for completing multiplication problems, And then in return, the students also get better at their division facts and are able to complete more division problems. That would be a response generalization where one behavior is affected kind of inadvertently by the behavior that we've changed. Training generalization. So ensuring generalization of behavior change is so important. Number one, it will make sure that the students are receiving the supports that they need in their least restrictive environment. When we have a student who is only trained in a special education classroom, in a small group setting, or in a one-on-one setting, the chances of them taking that skill or those skills and applying them to a whole group setting or to just different settings is slim to none. So we have to make sure that we're setting students up to be in their least restrictive environment, which means we have to train them to be there. It also helps us remember that we are not always going to be with our students, reminding them to do the right thing, prompting them, kind of guiding them along. We have to think of the big picture in that someday we are not going to be right by their side, helping them, guiding them, nor will their parents. So we have to be thinking about that long term. Even with really young kids, we have to be thinking about independence. Questions a teacher may ask when assessing a program for generalization. Um, one of the questions we would ask would be, has the skill been acquired? So has the student reached that fluency level that we can actually take that skill then and transfer it to different environments? Obviously, if they are not fluent and they're still at that acquisition level, we have to reach fluency before we can start to get them to the maintenance and generalization stages. Can the student acquire reinforcement without performing the skill? If someone else will perform the skill for them, then why would they do it themselves? So those are things we have to think about. If their only means of getting reinforcement is to do the skill themselves, then they're ready for that next step. If not, then they aren't. The book gave a good example of a student maybe with more severe disabilities standing in front of a pop machine with change in his hand, but never actually putting the change into the pop machine. If someone comes along, takes his change, puts it in the machine, and gives him the pop, he's never going to learn to do that himself. And then the third one, does the student perform part of the skill? If only part of the skill is able to be performed, then the student is not ready for that next step of maintenance or generalization. That is where we would go back to that task analysis piece and try and reteach the steps to get them more fluent in that particular skill, and then be able to move on to the next stages of maintenance and generalization. Some general guidelines to help facilitate generalization. The author offers 7, and I think they're all equally as important. The first one is teach desired behaviors, whether they're social or academic, within the natural setting where they should occur. Again, if we only train students to do the expected behavior and to perform the expected behavior in a small group setting, in the special education classroom, the chances of them transferring that into generalization and across settings is slim to none. Make sure that you employ a variety of caregivers for training. So this is where that school, home, community support comes in handy. So we want to make sure that there's several teachers, paras, different adults in the building, parents, peers, whoever that may be. They are assisting in the training, even if it's just prompting. This will decrease the probability that the behavior will become situation specific. So when you're building a behavior plan for a student, you really want to make sure that any adult working in the building knows exactly what that response is going to look like, so that the student doesn't grow to understand that it only applies in certain settings and not others. Which kind of leads into number 3, make sure that you train in a variety of settings. So again, the student understands that behavior is expected in all. Number 4, shift as quickly as possible to artificial cues and reinforcers to more natural ones. So thinking back to that prompting hierarchy, if we're having to use, hand over hand prompting, again, you're not always going to be right by that student side. So the faster you can fade into more of a natural prompt, and as quickly as you can fade reinforcers to more natural ones, the better off that student will be in the long run. Number 5, shift from continuous reinforcement to intermittent reinforcement. So again, more of kind of on that natural time frame to make sure that they are able to perform the skill without reinforcement all of the time. And then that leads us into kind of number 6, where we want to gradually increase the delays in the delivery of reinforcement. So making sure that we're providing some increased delays before we reinforce each behavior, getting the student to then maintain for longer periods of time without. And the last one would be to reinforce all instances for generalization. So anytime that we have those instances pop up where it's a skill that we can generalize, make sure that we're reinforcing it across settings, across situations, with different stimuli present so that the students grow to understand that we want them exhibiting this behavior no matter who they're around, no matter where they're at, no matter what the circumstances, that they are equally distributing and exhibiting this behavior across different settings. The authors also offer up categories for techniques for addressing generalization. These ideas come from Stokes and Baer. The first one is train and hope. So they talk about how sometimes unplanned generalization will happen when the skill itself becomes reinforcing. So sometimes we come across things that are accidentally generalized just because maybe the student finds it more intrinsically motivating. Sequential modify, when we sequentially modify, it's a procedure that allows stimulus generalization or transfer of training across settings. So we want to make sure that we're applying again to all settings, and a lot of these go along with the previous 7. This is just a little different model for addressing. We want to make sure that we introduce to natural maintaining contingencies. So when a student behaves appropriately for the same reasons that a student who never acts inappropriately does, then we've reached that point of generalization. So when things become more intrinsically motivating, or when a student is just motivated to do their work because they'll get a good grade, the same way that we're motivated to go to work because we get a paycheck. So we want to start to see them be motivated and naturally reinforced by the same thing that reinforces other students who don't have the same concerns in behavior. Number 4 is making sure that we train sufficient exemplars. So just providing lots and lots of lessons, lots of examples. And we always want to make sure that we show those in the positive. What should it look like? What should you be doing? Not training them to be able to show what it should not look like. We want to train them what it looks like. We don't want to train them to show that. So exemplar models. Training loosely, we focus so much on direct instruction sometimes, but there is specific research out there that shows that sometimes less intensive and more natural instruction will help promote generalization. So, for example, I know we've talked about this in our several um, examples of response strategies and teaching that alternative and reinforce, or I'm sorry, the alternative behavior and the replacement behavior. So we want to give that acquisition piece in direct instruction. So we want to teach them direct instruction model, practice, um, role play, all of those good things that we do to teach behavior in a specific setting where the student can acquire the learning. However, when we get them to the point of generalization, sometimes it's best to reinforce, um, prompt, those types of things in more of a natural setting, so more as behaviors occur, where we can maybe pull a student for small bits of time and reteach or pre-teach or reinforce a skill that they've learned already in their acquisition and fluency stages. Use indiscriminable contingencies. So again, going back to that intermittent schedule of reinforcement. So when a student um, starts to respond when they are not reinforced every single time they display the behavior, then they are more likely to continue to perform the good behavior, not knowing exactly when they will be reinforced for it. And again, that's not something we would want to do at the acquisition stage, or even as they're acquiring fluency. This would be when we get to the maintenance and generalization stages. Program common stimuli, so introducing natural elements into their training environment. So whatever skill it is that we want them to generalize, maybe into different settings, when responding to different people, whatever that skill may be, we can, as we're training them in the training environment, so say the special education classroom, we can introduce natural elements as we're able. So for example, if a student doesn't have appropriate response strategies to peers, but they do to teachers, we can gradually bring other peers in to practice that skill so that they become used to practicing that skill, but in a controlled environment. And then the last ones, they kind of tied together there: mediate generalization and train to generalize. Basically, it's just providing that reinforcement in a new setting. So when we start to get a student to that generalization point, we continue to reinforce when they're able to show that skill in a new setting versus in our controlled setting of, again, perhaps the special education classroom. As far as chapter 12 goes, the notes for this we're actually going to go over in class. So when you're in class tonight, we'll go over that portion of the PowerPoint. Um, since I am bringing some social skills resources and we're going to talk about different strategies for teaching the replacement or alternative skill as well as self-management, I thought it would be best to go over those at the same time. So we'll do that in class. When you come to class on Monday, as far as your assignments go for the week, um, you don't have a ton, but I also don't want this to be misleading because you do have your mock presentation of your FBA and your BIP that will be completed in class next Monday. So you need to be prepared for that. We will go over all that information in class, but you will have your case study assignment number 7, your monitoring plan that will be due this Friday on November 20th by 11:59 p.m. And then it will be your job to prepare for that mock presentation. Again, we'll go over all of that information in class on Monday, but you will need to be prepared to come to class with that ready to go on November 23rd. If you have any questions or comments, you know where to find me. Otherwise, I will see you in class.